Are we good? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Deirdre Dela Cruz, and I am Associate Professor of History and Asian Languages and Cultures here at the University of Michigan, and I'm also the co-PI for the ReConnect, ReCollect project. Before all else, I'd like to declare that the University of Michigan is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land transfer to the University of Michigan. This was offered through the treaty at the foot of the rapids so that the children of these nations could be educated. Through these words of acknowledgement, their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and their contributions to the university are renewed and reaffirmed. I would also like to confirm that the University of Michigan holds one of the largest collections of Philippine materials in the country, if not the world, because of the university's intimate involvement and deep complicity with the United States colonization of the Philippines. Even before America's takeover from Spain in 1898, and before the brutal Philippine-American War that followed, University of Michigan faculty and students collected from the Philippines flora and fauna specimen, and the colonial taking of all manner of cultural material continued well into the 1920s and beyond. This history of colonial collecting and colonial knowledge production is at the cornerstone of a number of the university's most renowned museums, archives, and departments. And illuminating and remediating this history is what has brought us here today. Before introducing our guests of honor, our artists, I thought it would be helpful to say a little bit more about the ReConnect, ReCollect project and about what our group has been involved in that kind of led to the artist residence. So this project is one that has a really long history of scholarship, of activism, and of community engagement, but it is one that has been more comprehensively and more powerfully organized thanks to the generous support of the Humanities Collaboratory and the Office of the Provost. We are a group of interdisciplinary faculty, curators, librarians, collection managers, graduate students, undergraduate students, and members of the Filipino and Filipino-American community committed to developing decolonial and reparative approaches to the vast collections of Philippine materials on campus. And this is really one of the things that I think makes our group unique, is that we are able to bring together individuals and institutions that, you know, because of the usually hierarchical structure of the university, are generally kept apart. This is the end of the first year of a two-year project, and this two-year project is grounded in three initiatives, or what we think of as kind of reparative pillars. These are reparative curation, reparative connections to community, and reparative scholarship. By reparative curation, we mean the surveying of as many of the Philippine materials on campus as possible, and the assessment of harms in these collections at every level, from acquisition to description to their use and their accessibility. By reparative connections to community, we mean the sort of projects that we're doing here with the artist residency, reaching out to various Filipino and Filipino-American communities, both locally and broadly in the diaspora and in the Philippines. And by reparative scholarship, we mean to bring together, after this two-year project, a kind of model of what decolonial and reparative approaches to colonial collections might look like. So those are the three kind of distinct but overlapping parts of the ReConnect, ReCollect project. And it's at this point that it makes sense to introduce our team, who is here and broadly part of the roundtable, even if they may not be sitting up here with the four of us. So if I can introduce Nancy Bartlett, who is the Associate Director of the Bentley Library, Martha O'Hara Conway, who is at the Special Collections Research Center. Robert Diaz is one of our PhD students from the Department of History. Sony Prosper, who is a PhD student in the School of Information. Emily Na, who is a PhD student in American Culture. Chad Kamen, who is a master's student in the School of Information, Kirsten Barnt, who is the Director of Museum Studies and the German Department. Susan Go has been extremely helpful to this project and this residency. She is the Southeast Asia librarian at the University Library. And I know that there are some other people back there. Nick Trudeau, who is a PhD student in anthropology. Jim Moss, who is a collections manager at the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropological Archaeology. I finally got it right. Ricky Punzalan, who is way back there, my partner in crime and the co-PI of the ReConnect project. There is also Christy Reed, who has been our project coordinator, who could not be here today. And Madeline Bacolor is our community liaison. And last but certainly not least, we have in our presence one of our community elders, Adawisa, also known as Deling Weller, who has been a longtime member of the U of M Filipino community, but also the Ann Arbor Filipino and Filipino American community at large, and also serves on our external advisory board. So we're very pleased to be together and working on this project. This is also, I think, the appropriate time to thank the numerous curators, directors, and collection managers at the many repositories that we've been working with. It is really because we've been able to build relationships of mutual trust and because of their willingness to participate with us in this work of self-reflection and kind of self-critique that a lot of our work is possible. So without further ado, let me say a little bit more just about the artist residency and then introduce our artists before we kick off our conversation with them. It looks like somebody wants to come in from that side. I don't know if anybody wants to open that up. So the idea for an artist residency came out of one of several listening sessions that we held last summer when we were in the project development phase of this grant. And it was just broached as one really terrific way to engage the broader community beyond the academic and scholarly community, but also as a way, one of the things that we're really interested in is trying to figure out, what the value of these collections are, these colonial collections from the Philippines for communities of descent. And artists seem like a perfect way to help us think through that and to illuminate that for us. And then what we did is we kind of tapped our networks to identify potential artists, and then we did an invited call for applications. And from those applications, we have our 3 artists here who we selected, not just because of their immense talent, but also because their art really exemplified for us what we think of when we talk about repair and repairing historical harm, repairing the harm that is inherent in a lot of these colonial collections, and in re-envisioning different narratives of this very complex history between the United States and the Philippines. So I'd like to introduce our 3 artists. We have, starting here, Maya Cruz Palileo, who is a multidisciplinary Brooklyn-based artist. Maya's work centers themes of migration and a permeable context of home. Their work is inspired by the oral history of their family's arrival in the United States from the Philippines, as well as a colonial relationship between the 2 countries. Maya is no stranger to archival research, having spent time in the Newberry Library, looking at both Filipino and American constructions of Filipino and indigenous cultures. And one of the things that really struck us about Maya's work is the really powerful way that they look at the visual colonial archive, kind of remove subjects from those colonial constraints, and then lovingly, I think it's safe to say, recontextualize those subjects in beautiful kind of hybrid landscapes. To their left is Jana Año Nuevo Langholtz. Jana is an interdisciplinary artist, photographer, and independent researcher born at the site of the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. She is a creator of the Filipino-American Artist Directory and is perhaps becoming best known as the caretaker of the Philippine Village Historical Site in Clayton, Missouri. And this is 47 acres where over 100 years ago, Filipinos and indigenous peoples from the Philippines were brought to be displayed in a kind of human zoo as a part of the cultural propaganda of US imperialist rule. Jana's commemorative project includes several reparative initiatives, including walking tours where the village stood, trying to restore the identity and names to every one of the approximately 1,200 Filipino or indigenous persons who were brought to populate the village, and properly marking the graves of indigenous persons who died during the World's Fair and were buried in St. Louis. Finally, we have to her left, Francis Estrada. Francis was born in the Philippines and currently resides in Brooklyn. He is a visual artist and educator who uses art as a tool through which to confront how our understandings of culture and history are mediated. His work interrogates how visual cues found in historical photographs, mass media, political propaganda, and personal archives influence or inflect social or cultural narratives. Francis works as a museum educator at MoMA in New York City, and as a freelance educator of Filipino art and culture in communities across the country. Francis is also a guro, or a kind of master teacher of the Filipino martial arts form known as Pekiti Tirsia Kali, and several of us got a chance to witness Francis doing that with some of his friends the other day. So here are our artists. Please give them a round of applause, and thank you all for coming. Thank you to online. I'm now going to sit down and transform into a talk show host. Hello. Okay. So this is really, in true roundtable fashion, this is really meant to be a kind of conversation among us, and one that will open up to also anyone in our ReConnect team. So the first question, or one of the things that I thought made sense to open with is what you guys thought you were getting into when you accepted our invitation. Thank goodness. What were your expectations for the residency? And how has the experience now over these last almost 2 weeks paired with what you were getting? Expectation and then like the reality. And I should say at any time, if you want to what do you think you were getting into?
That working? Oh yeah, okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for bringing us here, and all of you for coming today. I just have to say that I've had a lot of emotions the past time that I've been here. In terms of what I expected, I guess I just didn't really know the magnitude of the collection, yeah, that was kind of, I didn't quite know what it was going to be like. Couldn't picture it. I couldn't visualize it. And from what I had seen online, like a very different experience looking at things online than actually being here, being immersed in the material itself.
Mm-hmm.
But with the help of everybody on the team and being together with Francis and Jana has been sort of like the unexpected gift of this project. But I'll let you guys answer.
Oh yeah.
I want to agree with, I'm actually going to take it out. I agree with what Maya said about the magnitude of the collections. I think I came here expecting to continue my research about the 1904 World's Fair, and I was aware of the Wisher photographs and a lot of things associated with him, but I wasn't aware of the scope of all the objects and the artifacts, especially at the Research Museum Center and all these other things associated with these expeditions. So I think that was something that I wasn't expecting, and it's been really productive to, I think, engage with those things as well.
I should follow up and just say, you know, for those of you who aren't aware of just the scope and the scale of the collections, there are, there are archival collections, there are visual photographic collections, but there's also a vast amount of specimen of flora and fauna that were collected as early back as the 1870s. And there are really extensive archaeological collections as well. So just to say a little bit too about the process, we had kind of an orientation all together for the first 3 days where we introduced the artists to the different collections that included everything from, the mammals and mollusks to archaeological artifacts, and then archival materials and postcards and visual collections. So talking about like the scale and the scope and the vastness, I mean, it's also an incredible diversity of things that have been collected from the Philippines. And I think that that's something that not everyone really anticipates. We know about the photographs, we know about, kind of like correspondence. Some people might even know about the archaeological collection, but there are animals, there are plants, I mean, the scale is really pretty unfathomable.
Everything.
It's literally
Literally
everything.
took everything.
Yeah. We yeah.
Lift it up and they have it.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, you took the words out of my mouth. That's what I was going to say when you talked about expectations coming into this residency. First, I want to say thank you also for your support and for the cohorts and the team of ReConnect, ReCollect, because even before we came here, you prepped us well enough in our Zoom meeting, but also making sure we had resources, online resources to prepare ourselves to look at the collection. And, preparing for it, I knew I had an idea about the content, about what I was going to see. I was thinking photographs, manuscript, historical archives, but as soon as we got here, just the breadth of it was very surprising. Other thing that was surprising was my reaction to it. I had been looking at so many objects online, doing some research, and it is difficult. It is different being surrounded by objects at the RMC. Manuscripts where you have American soldiers, American officers, or you had having everything there, just that being said, one thing that was also a very pleasant, very wonderful surprise is the amount of collaboration and or commiserate about some of the writing that we read.
Yeah, sure. Ton to process, I think, every day, every minute. Did week 1 and 2 differ for you? I mean, so, there's something about 2 weeks. I don't know exactly how we came up with 2 weeks, but we thought it was long enough for the artist to get a sense of what we had and to take a fairly good dive, by no means an exhaustive one, but not so long that we lose you forever, like in the in the abyss. Did things feel different between the first and second week? How would you characterize?
Definitely. Yeah. The first week, like when you were describing we came, one of my questions before I came was like, are we going to have an orientation? Cause I like looking at the Excel spreadsheets. It's just not, I don't know. But so once we got the tour and there were like materials that we had requested that were out, for me, it was really helpful to see all that. So week 1 was just very overwhelming kind of, but also lots of discoveries happening because especially people in the team, they're doing certain research that I didn't know about, and really just the team talking and us talking. There wasn't really a way for me to know what I was looking for until I started talking to everybody, and we would say, oh, I found this here and I found this here. Oh, that sounds interesting. This sounds interesting. So there was like this synergy of the team effort as opposed to just me coming in and thinking that I knew what I wanted to look at. And then in that process was also a discovery process. I don't know if that's just kind of how I work as an artist, but like one thing leading to another. I usually, sometimes I have an idea of what something might become, but in the process of looking at one thing, it leads to the next and the next in unexpected ways. And so that was really happening a lot I mean, for the whole time, basically. But I think once I kind of narrowed down the things that I wanted to look at, then it was just, at the end of last week and then all of this week, just really spending time, slowing down and spending time with those things. I know there's not enough time for me to go through everything, but one of the things that I noticed in week 2 was I felt like sort of a physical attraction to the objects at the RMC, and just literally holding them and feeling their weight, and just being in the presence of them felt very different than going through images, lantern slides and stuff like that. So that became important for me in the second week. And then it kind of opened up sort of towards the end where I was a little bit more familiar where I was. So I could have a little bit of a more, I don't know how to describe it, maybe intimate relationship with what I was looking at, as opposed to in the beginning, it was like, whoa, there's this and that and this and that,
Yeah.
like I gotta do this. And, it just, I was like really buzzed at first, and then everything like came really down. Like I couldn't leave the house today is like how down it came. So.
Yeah. Yeah, mine's pretty much the same. And it was pretty telling because after the first day, we ended up seeing a film, everything, everywhere, all at once. And that's what it felt like. The first couple of days, especially orientation, was getting acquainted with the collections and what the holdings were for each collection or for each space. And then, I gravitated towards materials I was somewhat familiar with. But then as I got acquainted with them, I was able to then kind of switch pathways and see what else kind of piqued my interest. And then by week 2, I knew which directions I wanted to go to. I had notes and saying, okay, I need to see these papers, I need to see these papers, memoirs. And then as of today, I started feeling like it was more of a race because as I'm looking at these memoirs and letters and correspondences, I realized I just don't have enough time. So it's more of okay, how much is already digitized and how much can we get digitized? Versus how much is necessary, how much should I read? So I think tomorrow is going to be even that.
I have a similar response to Maya and Francis, but the first week was, I felt like I was just taking in a lot. The group orientation was really, really helpful to look at things together as a group and just like get acquainted with all the collections. And I feel like by the end of the first week, I just kind of like worked myself to a point of like being overwhelmed with everything. And something similar kind of happened to me is I had to just like take a day and not do anything just to kind of like reset myself and like start to like process all these things that I'd seen. Like I was just like looking at all these photographs in rapid succession, and it was just a lot to process. The second week I feel like has been more making and like producing things, because that's how I process, is I tend to make things as I am processing. So, and I can talk more about that when we put the slides up, but yeah, I've been making work this week, mostly the second week.
Do it. We could do it anyway. If it makes sense, you want to show, is there something that you want to show right now?
Yeah, we can start with photo 1.
Yeah, so tell us about this.
So one of the things that I came here knowing is that recently I found several of my family's names in the 1904 World's Fair catalog. So I've been trying to track down how they participated and what they contributed. And one of those things was a model house. So in the Excel document that Jim had sent us prior to the residency, I'd seen that there are 2 model houses in the UM collections, and this is one of them. It's 3 feet, I'd say. And I really wanted to give this house like a context or like a space to like live in. So the house was at the RMC, and as I was looking through these images at the Bentley, I found this postcard of it's an Ipa palm, which is the same material that would have been used to construct the house. So I took that postcard and went to FedEx and made a big print of it. The background. You can go to slide 2. So this is when I photographed the house with the backdrop, and then second photo also incorporates some, it's a small chicken that dates to 200 BCE from Lumban Laguna, and then a cat around the same time period. And I haven't been able to confirm if this was actually the house that came from the Philippines list, but it would have been something close to that. And then I just have one more photo to share with the house's photo view. So on the left is a really similar house built by my grandfather on our mountain. And then the photo on the right is a larger model of a house that's in off-site storage on campus.
So you did the work of basically recontextualizing these objects, or kind of recreating the environment and placing them in that was reminiscent of the photo on the left, the photo that is your family's.
I was going to ask you what that photo was because I saw it in the slides and I was like, that looks really joyful.
Yeah, so
Now I know why.
another context to that photo is that my dad was an aspiring National Geographic photographer and took that photo in the 80s when he and my mom met. So that's from his collection of photos.
Wow.
Um,
These are the slides that he
Yeah.
had given to you?
yeah, that's one of his slides. And I hadn't even gotten into those slides until the team had reached out about the residency. I was like, Dad, you need to tell me about these slides. So
You have all of this additional context. Wow. That's so first week, second week, different. There's some like I mean, I think everyone could say, and I think the team might agree that the first week feels a little bit frenetic because we're just trying to introduce you to as much material as orient you in some of the logistics of requesting things. And everybody then kind of slowed down in drop in affect, or just, I mean, I'm tired. I don't know if you guys are tired. I'm imagining you guys are really tired, but like, it's, it is a lot to do. Are there anything else that you want to maybe add or illuminate for us about how you decided on what you were going to look at? And it comes out, but if there's the process of doing the research here that you want to add. Exciting.
Sure, I can go first, and we can go into my photo number 2, if that helps. So I started off, as I said, looking for things that I was familiar with and I had used. So the example on the left is a photograph from the Philippine War Collection. And I have been looking at this photograph through the Library of Congress because they have a copy of it online too. And I used the image to make a drawing. And the whole idea was the image on the left is a photograph of a quote unquote dead insurgent. During the Philippine-American War, it was common practice for American soldiers to actually document and photograph the dead, make postcards, and kind of send it back as a record of the war and record of their conquest. So the work that I had been doing is to kind of change the image and change the narrative, and basically remove the figure from the space, change the context, and give it a new feature. The idea is to give a different kind of ending to this person's story. So instead of the figure lying on the ground, I wanted him to be upright and to be floating. So I wanted to look at first things that I had been looking at but never saw in person, never handled in person, just to make that physical connection. And then as I moved on, I decided to think about, well, since I'm dealing with narratives, if you go into photo number 5, I started looking at the different manuscripts written. The one on the left, as I mentioned earlier, was written by a high school student in Cebu. And it was his response to how he and his fellow students had been treated by their American teacher living in the Philippines. And he said something along the lines of, "Sir, if you will not strangle him," and this is someone writing a school official about the teacher, "Sir, if you will not strangle him in other place, surely," and sorry, I can't see, "and very sure we will kill him. He receives salary, wore clothes, shoes, etc. by the Filipino money. We know he comes in this place to save money because he has nothing to eat in his country." But basically the gist of it, he says that he treats us like savages when he himself is the savage. So I wanted to hear that story coming from the students. And on the back, it's actually text from the Sullivan papers. It's about the soldiers' accounts. So what I'm hoping to do is collect these stories and come up with new narratives and kind of match them with different figures that I see in the collection as well. Which direction it goes, I'm not sure if I'm going to end up making drawings. I'm not sure where I'm going to go, but at least, you know, I've been exposed to these letters and these messages and these and these narratives. So I'm at a point where it seems exciting, and where it goes, who knows?
Great. I mean, this is an extraordinary letter. And I mean, one of the things that you said the other day, if I can share this, is that, you know, I saw this letter and it was a way to, it kind of activated like a force field. Maybe I'm saying that wrong, but that's how I heard it. Like, and I think we all have this experience, especially when we're confronting what are really difficult materials, is we look for those objects or those gazes or, you know, the agency of the colonized to kind of speak to us, and then to provide us with to activate some sort of protection, right? Like against all of the stuff that you're looking at. And this was a letter, I believe that was careful.
Beware the black hand.
Beware the black hand, the letter ends, right?
Yeah, so in a way it became my my oracion, or my prayer.
Yeah.
So I would read that to give myself protection before I go into in the collection and start reading these accounts from the American side.
Right. So let's talk a little bit more about, you know, the kinds of things you encountered and what your reactions and your response. We're beginning to share, which is great. Are there what other sorts of encounters did you have that really spoke to you, that surprised you? What were some of the more challenging things encountered in these collections? What were some of the more joyous things? I mean, one could find to find that speaking back, but for each of you, I mean, what?
All right. I just was thinking so much while you guys were talking, and also just in terms of this letter and finding things that were written not by the colonizers, which is practically, even though there are essays by students, it's still happening in this American education classroom, which I was really interested in trying to find the books that they used at that time, the Thomasites used at that time. And Chad, who is an amazing, awesome, able to find everything, helped me to find an essay by a Thomasite teacher that outlined a day of what a day at school looked like. And I thought that was really, I don't know, that was the tiring part of it, to have to constantly look through this material. Like, I just feel like it's, you talked about when we got here and it was like, oh my gosh, there's so much, but it's also like being confronted with either you're walking off the cliff into Empire or like walking into a wall, and there's like no relief. But I will share some images because I find relief in some of the things that I see. Could we look at photo 2? So, so in my work, I looked at a lot of these photographs from the Philippine American War, and what I would notice and like my intention in looking at these was to look for things that kind of broke the purpose of these pictures. And so on the screen on the left is it's a stack of lantern slides, which are kind of like the 35mm slides that you put in a carousel, but they're a little bit bigger and they're made of glass. And so I just stacked a bunch of them on top of each other. And I think it was sort of a image that explains a lot or describes to me visually a lot of what this experience has been like. And in fact, like the first night I think we talked about this a little bit, but just having all these flashes of like what we're seeing. But at the same time, for me, just the experience of, why am I continually interested in this material, even though it's so hard to be in? And then the image on the right is from a postcard. It's a detail from a postcard. And I love these moments where, her face is facing us, but it's also facing away from us. And it's not totally legible, which those are the kinds of things that I kind of look for. And it kind of takes a little bit of time to look at these things. And so that's what I find interesting for me, which is where the sort of the starting off point from where, and then which I make my work. So the next slide would be photo 3. And just as an example of recent paintings. So that's kind of my process on looking at these photographs and then taking these figures and placing them into sort of a new context, a new narrative that's out that, they're still of the colonial era, but they, I guess my impetus is to see them in a different light. And then photo 5. And I just thought this image was really kind of also telling of this experience where, so on the left is a detail of a postcard. And then on the right is a painting that I made in 2019 called 1,000 Arms Offered. And the care that you were talking about, and I think the thing for me about looking at these materials of colonization is this, I don't know, I think for me as an artist, I really think about slowing down and just really, really slow looking and being with what I see. And in terms of all of the caption, like the manuscripts that come along with a lot of these images, especially in the Worcester collection, these huge volumes, like I just can't deal with, like I don't want to read it. I just don't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
because it's so strong in what he's trying to say and what that point of view is. So I think for me is part of a lot of the things I'm looking for are, this could just look like a regular postcard, but zooming in on these little details where this hand gesture is like, it could be read so many different ways. They're connecting, they're gently touching each other, but they could also be forming like a barrier, and I think that kind of multiple reading of images is what I find really interesting. And also the last thing I'll say is just Yeah, what was I going to say? I want to say something about desire, like
Yeah.
I mean, I know that the library is open from like 10 to 5 or 10 to 4 or whatever, and I'm just like there, but I do have this like unrelenting desire to see this stuff. And I think that that's really important, and especially in the work that I make, thinking about desire, because, it wasn't something that I think maybe was attributed to the people that are in the photographs. And I just think a lot about that essay by Eve Tuck, Suspending Damage, open letter to the community. Anyway, she talks about like how damaging these photographs are. I mean, this is the whole basis of this project, of like how things are framed and the language and valorizing, colonists and all that. So that's like the damage, but then the sort of salve to that, or the other part of that, or I mean, maybe reparative is the other part of that, but there's like a third part, which is this idea of desire, which is something that that I feel, but I'm not sure if I can articulate it quite yet. But anyway, that's been coming up for me.
You repeat your question?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe we can sit with this for a little bit, because I'm really interested in kind of a third, especially with this project, we think so much about remediation and repair as if there's kind of a solution. There's like the thing that you can do that will fix it, right? One of the things that we're learning, and I think that you've all helped us realize, is that there's really no end to, really no terminus to all of this. One, because the damage is so immense, but also because there are all of these other kinds of affects or interpretations, readings that can come out of the material that is not first and foremost about, I don't know if this speaks to what you're saying. Desire
The
aspect of
thirding.
it, which is,
Mhm.
yeah, the thirding or the otherwising, as we were talking about very early on in the project. And I think that's the value of bringing, different kinds of communities, and that it generates for us a vast number of possibilities beyond what we could have even. That feels really harm and repair. All for that, first of all. But the question was around, things you've encountered, and what, if you examples of, what was something that was really just challenging and why, and maybe something that was, really inspiring in a surprising way. That was the original question.
Yeah, I can answer that. And also in response to what you were talking about with repair and repairing the harm in these things that we're looking at. So Chad, if you could go to my photo 4. So something I came across while I was researching in the Bentley, I was looking in a box of papers associated with Richard Schneiderwind, who was a man from Detroit that was involved in, he was the person who was leading something called the Filipino Exhibition Company, and taking Igorots to all these amusement parks or sideshows around the country. And as an extension of what I've been doing in St. Louis, I was looking at these photographs, which, they're not named, their identity has been just like stripped from these photographs, and they just become, this, yeah, thank you. I came across Timacek's story, who was a young man who traveled with Schneiderwind from 1905 all the way to 1913. And I learned that he was in Detroit we also went to go visit the site of that village, and I have that in another slide later. But I started following his story and learned that he traveled with Schneiderwind until they were in Belgium. And sorry, my voice is breaking up a little bit. He died there in 1913 at around 28 years old. And you can go to the next slide. He was the only person to ever be memorialized, as far as I know, with a sign or something that says his name on it. So this is a sign in Ghent, Belgium, called the Timocek Tunnel. And it's just, it's like a street tunnel, and there's this sign that hangs over it. So like as an extension of what I'm doing in St. Louis, I found this really moving that, you know, somewhere in the world, in Belgium, like one of these people is remembered. And I happened to find his photograph the next day in the Bentley. So that was something that was also really surprising to me, was just to find his image there in the collections.
It was right on top.
And it was right on top.
He had floated himself. He found you, exactly. Francis, do you want to?
Sure. I talked a little bit about what I encountered. And, you know, with all this, and I think that's something we talked about, is the idea that what we are able to do as artists is able to make changes. If we see something, we can alter it a bit to give us joy. And for me, if you go to my photo number 3, it's what I've been doing the past few years when this is a video, you can play it. It's only 10 seconds long, so I'm not sure if you want to keep playing it. What I try to do, as I mentioned earlier, is I try to take images and stories that I've seen from different archives. And I spoke about the one on the left. The one on the right is also an image. It's a drawing based on a photograph of also a fallen revolutionist. And in the center are 2 different videos, or in the center in the video are 2 different sources. The still background is from a photograph of a massacre in Budbagsak in Holo. And on top of it, I superimposed a video by Thomas Edison of a propaganda video he made in New Jersey to support the Philippine-American War, to support the war in the Philippines of the Americans. So there's supposed to be Filipinos retreating from the trenches, but I reversed it. So they're advancing from the trenches instead of retreating from the trenches. So in a way, I changed the story that way. And if you go back to slide number 1, what I've also been doing is playing around with the idea of what are these images, how have they been used, and how can we change them? So the one on the left is basically an advertisement and a flyer for people to go to the Igorot village, to the human zoo. So last year, I received a grant in New York City to do a group exhibition. There were 3 of us. So I took that design and I made a new flyer, a new digital collage to kind of own that story, own that narrative, and kind of take that. And you know, I used some of the same wording, but what was on display was nothing of the sort. So in a way, is making that change. And then over here, if you go to slide number photo number 4. Are things that I found that gave me joy over here. One, or even more designs of flyers and ads that I can alter. So getting more source material. But in the middle, it's like the constant ups and downs, especially from what happened in Texas just the other day. I see the story about massacres by soldiers in the Philippines, children being killed. But then around the same time, just the other day, there was an object of protection that was worn by a datu. For protection. So you see good, you see bad, you see things that are horrifying, you see things that are optimistic, but it's just a balance. And I feel like what I've been able to do with the support of everyone and being in the space like this is being able to know that I can take some of the material, I can change that narrative. So when someone encounters this, I can give them maybe 3 sides to the story and they can choose which ones they want to follow with.
Open it up, even, you know, 3 sides of the story, open it up to an infinite number of So you all mentioned, being together, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that. I don't know, how unique this residency is. Having a group of artists versus artists come in, but what difference do you think that's made? Collective versus given everything similarly and access, camaraderie with the team and so forth by yourself, how would it still have been different? Or how is it different that you guys came together?
I can start. Some of the, not some, the art residencies I've been to have been more about making. So there's a lot of individual time where, maybe it's a 2-week residency, but you spend most of the time doing your own work. And then you debrief maybe at the end of the evening, early morning, but things aren't done collaboratively. And I think what's different about this one is you have the 3 of us who's interested in history and interested in some of these resources. And then we're able to have conversations with each other. For example, just earlier this afternoon, Maya was looking at some books while I was looking at some postcards, and I asked them, it's like, what is that in that book? And then, it's something that they had been looking at. It was like, this was from the Spanish-American War. I was looking at the Philippine-American War, but, we can share some of those insights and say, oh, I know you're interested in this. Check this out. So there's a lot less pressure of not just having to make, but we actually are just researching as much as we can. But also there's the help of, okay, I have this in mind, but I know that Jana and Maya, when they encounter something that they think I would be interested in, there's that suggestion, and there's that reciprocal kind of help as well.
I just want to agree with that. I think it's been really nice that we've been able to, I guess, just cover more ground together as a group. And, even when we're in the same space together, for a few days, we were all sitting together in the same room in the Bentley and looking at these different materials. And it felt like we were in 3 different worlds.
Yeah.
Just looking at these things. But then we're able to come together and share what we learned and share things that we would find of interest to each other. And that's just really nice. And that's not something you can do by yourself at a residency. And I think just the collaborative nature of this residency is really important, because I think this is collaborative work, the nature of going into these archives and, bringing all this information to the surface is something that needs to be done, as a group and as a community. And everyone brings such different interpretations and background to the things that we look at, that I think that in itself is just really important.
There's something too. I remember I walked into that room when you guys, it was so quiet. And yet, I think I made a joke about everybody, but it was a joke because you really did feel like you were I felt like I was in the presence of being in the presence of one another. Your own worlds, and you were immersed in your own world. Something about being as well. But I think that does make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's been amazing to be together, and I don't really know what I want to say about that because it feels so important. I guess we're out to dinner yesterday, and I was thinking about, I guess, just sort of processing how I've been feeling in the collections myself, and kind of coming up against this. I was calling it my inner colonizer, my internalized colonialism, where there were moments where I felt connected to what I was looking at. And then there are other moments where I felt like I was looking in, these materials are so I mean, even just this slide that's up, like I feel nauseous looking at it, but like there's a lot of ways that I feel in a way, I guess maybe just being the fact that we're all sitting here like Filipino American artists or people being together with like in a regular I want to say in the art world that I'm a part of. Sometimes I talk about my work and I'm like, did I say Philippines too many times? Like, they hate me. I just keep talking about the Philippines. I'm obsessed, and it's like, why is that not okay? And I think just being here with you all, including the team and everybody, like this whole project, it just feels like there's validation to that because I feel like that I'm not alone in it because I have a community for sure. But in this setting and in this like sort of sustained experience with the group, with Jana and Francis and with you guys, kind of going through it with us together, has been pretty amazing. And I think I definitely didn't know. I've been to residencies where everybody bonds, like going to camp, and then everyone's like, doing naughty things with each other. But like,
None of that has happened.
we're
here.
going axe throwing tonight, so that's that's our naughty thing we're gonna do together.
We still have time.
That's true.
But yeah, no, it's just been like, to hold this inside, it's too much, so it's been like to be able to be together in this way has, for me, just been really helpful to be and to feel free to talk about it and not feel like I need to hold back and not say anything.
Can I say too that, one of the gifts of having you here and having some of these events, and just spending time with you all I mean, I'm really struck by what you said about, you wonder, are you saying Philippines too much? Are you saying it too much? And I think, in the academic institution, there's that similar feeling of like, yes, you have your expertise. And so there's a kind of sanctioning of like, yeah, well, of course, that's your expertise. You should say that as much as you are authorized to do so. But I think what you're saying that connects to what I've been thinking is that like, it's okay to imagine like a Philippine-centered world. And it having a community where you feel like, yeah, everything can be focused on the Philippines. It doesn't just have to be like in one position or, like one exhibition or one, like that could be the world that we are able to come in and out of, stay in for as long as possible. Else, like, but we can turn it up to the audience too. I mean, if there are other things that you want to show. I did have a question just about, but a lot of you have spoken to it already about how you think this experience from your work going forward. The members of the team and
Before going there, I want to add on to the previous previous comment.
Yeah, Philippine-centered world. That's what we want to keep.
Keep it Philippine-centered. No, just the having grown up in the Philippines and then moving to the US, I experienced a sense of sometimes there's shame of looking at Philippine history because that's what we had been taught, even in school in the Philippines. Their Philippine traditions are not just old-fashioned, but they're primitive because that's what we had been told. And just today, I was reminded of it again, looking through the soldiers' letters. And these were letters sent to their families. So it's not necessarily meant for publication, meant for public consumption, but it just shows you the sentiment that they had. And sorry to have to read this, but this is from the Benjamin Stark Jr. papers. He said, "I'm sick and tired of this hole, of being in the trenches. There's nothing to do. The people are nothing but a thieving, lying lot of lazy colored folk. One colored man in the United States is worth a dozen of these things." So just seeing those sentiments, hearing those sentiments, and feeling those even when I moved to the US. But now having a chance to actually celebrate our culture, celebrate our history, and be able to take all these resources and share them and bring it back to the community, so we can celebrate as well and be proud of that as well. I think that's also a big reason that I was and am and am looking forward to what I do after this residency.
Yeah, I had one more image in the slide deck.
Yeah, go ahead.
Photo 6. I like to talk about. So talking about, what we learned here and what we're going to take back and how we're going to move forward. The photo on the left is from when we, as a group, went to Detroit for a day trip, and we located the site of Electric Park, which is where Timicheg was in a village with about 50 other Igrots for actually at the same exact time of year as we are here now, from May 19th to the end of June. So that was also kind of like this overlap in history, is that they were there at this time in May 1907, and we were there at this time in 2022, which is another coincidence. And the photo on the right is me standing in front of my house at the Philippine village. I also, I live in the former site of the Philippine village. And I think a big takeaway for me was I've always been very aware of the history of Filipinos in St. Louis, but I didn't know how much that extends throughout the Midwest and throughout the country. And learning about these stories like Timicheg, like that he was here in Detroit, one of, somewhere I wouldn't expect to find these stories, has just like led me down so many other paths. And I think is one of the things that I'll continue to research and move forward. And yeah.
Filipinos in the Midwest. Yeah, I didn't think that there was such a history either, but now, and then I got here and I was like, oh, there's a lot of that history here. So.
I have one more thing. Just,
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
it's like I was kind of a downer when I just talked about
No,
there has been like some cool things, like that picture of Timajek that was just sitting there. And then we were sort of talking about like how, like for me, my process has been like, I've been letting my sort of body and senses lead me to what I want to see next. And I feel like that's something that happens a lot just in my work in general. And I just put two slides. One of them is, I guess I'll show maybe 6. And this happens all the time where I'll make a painting and like I use my imagination in paintings. It's not like these are not, I mean, sometimes they're from photos, but a lot of times I'll take different environments, people, put them together, and then in the painting process, something will kind of come up. Like, for example, in this painting on the left, I made in 2021, which was last year. It's called We Walked for Hours, and this is a photograph of my Lola on the left, and I think one of her cousins or friends back home when they were girls. And I was making this painting, and it was kind of unfolding in this way. And then she's got her hand on the right side, and I was like, oh, it seems like she should be holding something. And if you look really closely, she's holding like a snake staff, which was just from the painting. It was just from the painting like process. I was like, oh, maybe she's holding a staff with a snake and maybe it's magical, and just kind of going with that. And then at the RMC, I found this walking stick with a snake and like this fist at the end with a heart, capiche shell heart that was inlaid in it. And I was just like, okay, I see you, like this is like the process. And, it's not even just the snake. It's like this clenched hand, like they're holding hands in this painting, and this hand at the end of the staff with a heart, a capiche shell heart. Like it just, I mean, those kind of things happen all the time. I'll make a painting and then I'll see something later and I'm like, wait a minute, I painted that, but I made that up, but here it is, so it's just like kind of cool things like that. that I find like very joyful, and also helps me to know that I'm like on the right path. And in that way, it feels a little like in this guided otherworldly way that I very that I feel confident in, that there will be these kind of like markers in that I've had in these past 2 weeks, that things like that will happen. There was also another story that I read in one of the essays that Robert introduced me to, the student essays, about a folklore story about something about a spirit, like a spirit being on a river, and then the boat like suddenly tipping when they talked about this spirit. And that actually happened to us. Like when I was a kid, we were on a boat, and all of a sudden, it was a pontoon boat too. It was like, those don't tip over. And all of a sudden it went like that. We were like, what the? And then it was like, turns out like my mom's aunt like passed away at that moment. Like
Right.
stuff like that happens all the time. And I'm like,
Oh.
okay, I see what, like, I know that this is desire that I'm looking for. It's like, it's here. I
That's
just have
right.
to like, I just have to be open to it, and like it comes, despite all the like, what is that carrot punching bag thing? You like walk and it just like punches you and you don't know. Like that's kind of how it felt like going in this archives, because you're like, oh, this and that, and then you're like, oh.
Boom.
So anyway, I just wanted to share some of the joyful moments too.
We could go on, but we've got such a great crowd here, so it'd be great to hear some questions or some insights from the team. Are there questions that anyone has? Yes. Yeah, Robert's going to go around and pass the mic around.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I noticed that a few of you had postcards that you had pointed out, and I'm curious if you could expand on that any way that you like. But in particular, I had two questions. One about the production of the postcards. It was mentioned that sometimes soldiers would take these really gory, disrespectful photographs and then send them. But did they have to send them to like a postcard making company, or is this effectively just a photograph and then on the back you'd write the address and that sort of thing? And then two, were there any postcards that you found that were actually made by Filipino peoples that are much more positive or uplifting? Okay, no.
Oh, I guess since I brought up the dead insurgent photographs, a lot of them were not necessarily postcards that are massive or mass produced. They're mainly produced by the military, and the military would send them off. And sometimes they just make the markings on the postcards themselves. And it's one of the sample caption would be Moro Juramento shot, and they would have the date and the place. And then as far as postcards produced by Filipinos, from what I know, these are postcards that came in to the US side. So they're produced and more than likely commissioned by American companies, and not Filipino photographers or postcard makers.
I mean, I'll say, I mean, I can answer that too, because I was with Francis yesterday looking at some of this examples of this postcard collection that's with the university library. And it seems like most of them were manufactured in the Philippines. And I don't know if some of them are actually just colorizing already existing photographs, but there's a whole range of subjects, not just, people, but landscapes and like different forms of transportation. And, that was also part of the propaganda machine, was to show exactly how much quote unquote progress was being made by the building and the development of an infrastructure. So there's no doubt that that the postcards were used, even if their handlers or the people that were sending and receiving them were using them kind of, well, the example Francis gave is not frivolous at all, but, sort of frivolously, they were part of that whole machinery of kind of projecting imperialism's progress in the Philippines. However, insofar as a lot of them are based on photographs of Filipinos and of indigenous peoples, there's always a possibility that the subject is not is not fully selling the message that the postcard wants to sell. One that I just sent to Jana, I sent a picture of to Jana earlier because it really spoke to me, is of a Filipino woman wearing kind of, Tagalog Filipiniana with a bicycle, And it looks very, kind of nostalgic and quaint, but she got the most epic side eye of like any, of any figure I've ever seen. And I was like, okay, this is the photo of the day. Like, this is the one that's going to protect me today. Because you're surrounded by all of this stuff and it's just so like, imperialist nostalgia. But then you come across a subject that's just like not doing it, like not willing to go along with the story. So I'm kind of you had a question?
Hi, my name is Melissa Levine. I work in the library here. And so I do think there's something sort of magical about artists and artist engagements. And I'm thinking about residencies in general and your engagement with the collections. And I'm wondering how much, especially, the kinds of comments you were making about this painting and the material evidence, as it were, that relates to it. How much do you think that there is something significant or unique about being artists engaging with this material? And how would it be different? I know it's just speculation. If you were historians or scientists or something else, what would a residency look like if we brought other kinds of people with different expertise or experience, same materials or something else?
This is just speculation because I'm not a historian, I'm not a scientist, but I can imagine the difference.
You are now. I mean, I don't know
Okay,
about a scientist.
So,
but,
what I can imagine is, just like Maya had mentioned earlier, we came in having a basic understanding of what we could find, but we were just reacting to the materials we saw and decided where to go. I could imagine having some friends who are historians and having some friends who are scholars and scientists. They usually come in with a thesis and a question already in mind, and they know which papers to look at. But for us, it was the benefit, but also it also made it more difficult because it was open-ended. So at this point, we just came in and we just wanted to see what would pique our interest, and then we go that direction. Whereas if I came in just looking for specific evidence and specific examples, maybe I would only go one direction. It would be more. What's the right word? Yes, that's it. Directed.
I think that for me, also just bringing in artists, I think that this work doesn't stay here. Like, it will come out in the work, and then that becomes seen outside of maybe the academic world or the historian like circles, those academic circles, and into a different, I guess, what would you call it? Public. Well, it's public. I mean, our work is seen by the public, and I think also, yeah, I think there's something about artists. I think artists are able to take this information and present it in a way that obviously has been processed through the artists themselves, but that it changes a little bit, I think, in that process, and other things can come in. At least in my case, I feel that there's a little bit of a more of an open-ended way to look at whatever comes from this or the work that I've done so far, that it can mean a lot of different things. And it doesn't have to, it isn't like trapped in this sort of narrative or in an archival box, that they get to be, in my case, that these figures get to be seen beyond somebody coming here wanting to do research and maybe seeing these pictures, and that, yeah, that they sort of become seen more.
And one of the ways to think about it too, I mean, as I'm listening to you guys talk about this, is that, this is also a way of expanding the archive itself. And, what the definition of an archive is much more capacious and, more kind of creative and more accessible. I mean, and that's really, one of the foundational things that we want to do is to make these collections more accessible. Yes, the actual physically, but also the reinterpretations and the kind of narratives, the new narratives that are coming out of this is one way, I think, of making this. If I had limitless resources at my disposal, you know, I could see, different kinds of artists residencies going on in perpetuity, not just visual artists, but also writers, right? Like poets, like playwrights and novelists and dancers. I mean, there's no end to, what a creative person could draw out of this. So I hope funders are listening, or other people in the university are listening. But yeah, thank you. I think there's a question up here, and then I think Professor.
Hi, my name is Celeste Catani. I'm co-president of the Filipino American Student Association on campus here at the University of Michigan. And I wanted to thank you all again for your residency and all the work you've done. Honestly, I'm learning so much. So I have two questions. The first I wanted to ask about was, I think there was something next to one of the postcards from the Igorot village that I think you had, Francis, and it looked like, do you know on the stone that was in that far right photo, what it would say, or if it's some sort of indigenous writing or language from the Philippines, or to me at least, it looks like Arabic scripture.
It is Arabic.
Oh, okay.
They didn't have a translation, the accession notes or field notes, but it said it was worn by a datu as means of protection, and the script is in Arabic, but it didn't have the translation in there.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then on the other side, it's actually two-sided. On the other side is a stick figure of a person, and there's some more markings and some more scripts.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you. And then my second question, so being in this residency and being surrounded so much by all these different, like this such like diverse materials, like you all said, and like thinking about different sort of collections like akin to this around the nation, what do you think is kind of the biggest thing all of you would take from this at looking in the future at different sort of like pieces of art or different sort of archives and so on from Philippines history, like beyond this collection?
Look like you're about to say something. That's why I keep
Oh,
looking
me?
at you. Yeah.
I think the biggest thing for me was really finding that house. Like just knowing that, that it could possibly have been made by, my great grandfather, and that it's here, it's been here all this time. It's been here for, over a century. And I think that was the biggest find for me here, and something that I'm going to take with me, even though I can't physically take it with me. I think the process of making those photographs and working with the house was a way of being able to, bring that with me in a way, something that I can bring back to St. Louis as a piece of this experience. Yeah.
And I think too, I mean, part of what we're doing as a team and as a bigger project is to experiment with different ways of engaging these colonial collections and histories, so that other archives, other institutions that have significant Philippine colonial collections can, try to gauge those collections in maybe. That's one thing, at least as a project, that we're hoping goes beyond just the Philippines.
And then I'll add something for one of the takeaways. I mentioned it before, but the personal accounts of history. I've done a lot of reading where it's historians writing about these accounts, but then reading, the soldiers' letters, reading notes from the students, and actually, I was going to share another one that it paints a picture that not all soldiers were for the war. There was one article in the Townsend scrapbooks at the Clements Library, where the article was basically had an example of a soldier's letter, a soldier's petition, asking other American soldiers to leave the military, and they equated it to what the Americans were doing during their Revolutionary War. They're saying, we're here fighting a war that we ourselves had fought against the British. So I urge you, my fellow soldiers, to to leave the fighting and then join the Filipinos. So accounts like that, and just knowing that, like we said before, there's not two sides, three sides. There's so many sides to the story, and that just through this experience and reading all those notes, scanning all those notes, because there's so many more I need to read. It's just very, very fruitful.
Yeah, Alyssa, and then I think Dr. Pedraza had a.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elisa Paredes. I'm in anthropology here. This is so phenomenal. Thank you all to everyone who's been a part of this. Yes, to Philippine-centric world. This is a question that's inspired by one previously asked, and it's meant as a provocation. So I hope it doesn't, I hope it doesn't come across in a weird way. But I guess the theme of historical revisionism has been fresh on my mind, certainly not least because of the frankly devastating results of the Philippine elections that we just had earlier this month. And I think it might have been you, Francis, who said that, part of being an artist means like being able to look at something and sort of change it, right? Change the narrative. But this is all, Francis might have said that, but it's certainly something that comes up in Maya's work and Jana's work as well. So I guess which is of course not to say that that's historical revisionism, but the question here is is there a line for you? Is there like a place that you're just definitely in my sort of allowing myself to kind of take creative liberty is just explore my desires with these objects? Is there a line that you wouldn't cross, I guess? Is there something that you definitely you're definitely never go there? This is the line that I draw between my creative freedom and revising history. Yeah,
Great. That's an interesting question.
okay. I hope I hope it wasn't weird. But it's something that is kind of fresh.
It was definitely weird, but it was a good question.
So weird.
Love weird.
Love weird.
Oh,
so that's
cool. We
good.
love weird.
You're in good company.
Thank you.
I guess the question of, I don't, like Francis said, I'm not a historian, so I don't know if I would be historically, if you can really rely on anything that I say or do or make, just don't believe it, because it's all fiction, but I was going to say something else. Oh, the line, I guess, I don't know if this is answering that question, but I know for me, one of the first time I looked at the Worcester Archive in Chicago back in 2017, I was very confused about how was I going to use these images in my work, because it just didn't feel right. They didn't feel, I really didn't want to reproduce those images. So it was a real struggle, and I didn't know what to do with them, although I had this huge trove of images to work with. So I think that kind of came to mind when you asked that question. The last thing that I would wish is that these images or whatever work that I produce would further the agenda, the colonial agenda. But yeah, so I think that was just something that, and then for me, it was just the physical process that the studio process, artistic process that occurred kind of led the way of how could I actually use these images, which involved a lot of drawing and I basically I just cut it all up and then put it back together in a different way. So that, I just sort of rely on my artistic, I guess, senses or whatever to do that work. I don't know if it's right or wrong, I can't say that, but I also, I don't know, if I think too much about it, I'll get paralyzed and never make anything or say anything or do anything.
And yeah, I agree with your approach and your answer. And, for me, it's pretty similar too. And, I told myself that when I do this kind of work, especially when I look at historic images and photographs and videos, I always said, I wouldn't work with depictions of humans as specimen. But along those lines, a couple years ago, that's when I started doing the drawings of the fallen soldiers. But I think as long as it's done respectfully and with the proper context, and to have a chance to have a conversation about it, not just put it out there for shock value, I think that's just really important. So basically, the answer is yes, I do have those limits, but who knows, if I find a way to cross it respectfully, then maybe I will go down that path too, and I won't keep myself from it. But it's definitely a thought that I keep thinking about, especially if I make drawings that look very realistic. And just recently, my drawings of the fallen bodies in that series, I started drawing based on photographs of Duterte's extrajudicial killings. But as long as I can change the context of it, and I can change the future of the figures that were depicted in photographs, I think I'm okay with it. But I'm not okay if I feel uncomfortable telling someone's story and doing it either unfaithfully or disrespectfully, if that makes any sense.
In the back.
Hi, I am Professor Sylvia Pedraza, Sociology and American Culture. In my American immigration class, I have used a documentary film that is very good, which is called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And at the end of that film, they actually go into the very, very end of the film. They go into the St. Louis World's Fair, and they show the Filipino village and so on. And it was not just Filipinos, by the way. For example, one of the people in the village was Geronimo, the Native American chief who had lost the war, and he was signing autographs for people, And then they also, they interview a historian by the name, I think, of Robert Rydell, who wrote a book about World's Fairs and what World's Fairs do, and not just the St. Louis one, but also the Chicago one and a couple of others and so on. So I just thought it would be interesting for you guys to maybe have that context, that bigger context of the meaning of a World's Fair for people who, at that time there wasn't television. It was sort of like the first way in which people could look at the rest of the world. It was, of course, humiliating to the Filipinos that were there because they were portrayed as people who were primitive and so on and so forth. But it was also a first encounter, like for many people who had never seen anybody else. I would like the lady who did visit the village say a little bit about how long did people live there? How did they live there?
Oh, so more context about the Philippine village is what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I can talk more about it in terms of my personal experience. I was born there. I live there. I've been surrounded with this history my whole life, and I didn't really start digging into it until after grad school and learning about the 1,200 Filipinos and indigenous peoples who were exhibited there. But how I understand it is that, they also lived their lives there. They were there for 8 months, and, they fell in love and they had children, people died, they're doing, they're living their lives. And I think that's really important to remember is that, while they were in this position where they're being exhibited, they also had a lot of agency on their own. And I understand myself as someone who lives there is that my history is also intersecting with theirs, and which is what led me to do this work and learn about these all the stories of these people. What else can I say about the Philippine village? It was part of a much bigger display. The 47 acres was just part of a much bigger exhibit, bigger than Central Park in New York. And a lot of different peoples were exhibited. You mentioned Geronimo.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot, there's been a number of kind of monographs written about the World's Fair, and there's been, a fair amount of historians who have written about the Filipino exhibits at the World. But what I find so fascinating about what Jana is doing is it's not meant to be like a reconstruction of that actual, like a historical reconstruction of that village. It's a profoundly commemorative project. And it really is, as far as I understand it, everything you've said about it, it is one in which a lot of temporalities are intersecting. And there's a real power to having the temporalities of commemoration intersect with the historical temporality of that village's existence. And that's what I find really powerful about it, including her own personal biography, and not just in the sense born there, but also in the sense that she found a grandfather who actually participated in some way, right? I mean, all of those things, it's almost that challenging a kind of historicist narrative that is really exciting and really more radical, I think, than what historians have said.
Yeah, and then on that note, since you talked about, film response to the World's Fair, I was also interested in it. And the first time I met Jana was when I was doing research at the Missouri Historic Society, the Missouri Public Library, but also the couple of films that I looked at. One was Meet Me in St. Louis, which was a popular musical, and it showed the excitement of people living in St. Louis for the fair. It didn't go into the fair so much, but it just showed the excitement of the people for it. And then there's also a film by a Filipino artist named Marlon Fuentes, who did Bontoc Eulogy. And it's not necessarily based on fact, but he used the artistic agency to talk about the fair too, but also to kind of place himself and his family members as being members of that fair.
So in typical Filipino fashion, we can all make pilgrimage to St. Louis and visit Jana. Are there any, we're already past 6 o'clock. Time has flown. We have food. Oh, there are a couple more questions. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mikey Delphia. I'm an undergrad here, also a member of FASA. And I was wondering, I know the collection and the Worcester collection is a lot of like Spanish American War, Philippine American War, early American imperialist and colonialist archives and stuff. But personally, I'm Japanese and I've always tried to learn more about Japanese-Filipino relations. And so I was wondering if you guys ever covered like the war or mid-century kinds of topics, or American later or neocolonialism in your artwork.
Sorry, I was just laughing because I saw Susan laughing, but the table of the Japanese occupation was like empty. It's empty.
Disintegrating. It's like fragile. Yeah.
And so we're trying to get budget or more.
And to answer your question, I was going to, but because it happened fairly recently, my mother's family were affected by it, and there were during the fighting, a lot of their home, a lot of their paperwork was burned and destroyed. And then hearing stories about how some other family members had to hide from the Japanese when they went there. As soon as I got to those stories, it was just a little too much, too close to home, and I decided to kind of back away from it. But who knows, maybe 20 years from now, I'll get into it.
And we have one more question up here, and I think I might give you the last question. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. The connections you've been able to make between the archive and art by being here is it's amazing. My question, what I was struck at the very beginning in your opening comments was that you had no idea of the scope, scale, usefulness. You had open-ended questions, and you came. But what I'm wondering, if you could speculate, maybe this is a good question for the end of this, about what we can do to close the gap, the knowledge gap, between what you found and what you didn't know when you agreed to come here and experiment. Archivists traditionally will either create an exhibit online, digitize a handful of things and promote it, or they prepare lists, finding aids, spreadsheets, etc., or nothing sometimes. And so it's like there's a huge gap here. And now that you're here, can you put yourself in a position of someone like you that wasn't here, and what we can do to close the gap somewhat, short of digitizing everything?
I have an idea. So there's a couple different things actually. One thing that the Field Museum of Chicago had done so well is the idea of co-collaboration, where they invite people from the community to work with curators and look at different objects and feature them. So it's not necessarily just something that's been produced by a curator, but someone a curator works within the community. So that could be one example. Another one I keep thinking about is the idea of online publications, and something similar to MIT's Visualizing Cultures. Visual essays, I think, are very helpful for people to see what's there. But then within an accompanying essay, you do have the context that kind of goes with what's in the collection. So those are just two things just off the top of my head I can think of.
Yeah, and I think also just, I was asking Deirdre before about funding, like can people get funding through the university to come here? I mean, I've known that the university has a big collection, and I was choosing between Chicago and Michigan back in 2017, but I chose Chicago. But I think like just knowing about those resources, that there are resources to come, even if it's not an artist residency or whatever project a person might be working on, that it is possible. And I also just was thinking, there was a question earlier. Anyway, I just thought, it's so different to be here alone, like to be here than it is to do. You can only go so far online, but to be here is just something very different. And if you're interested in coming here, then I think there are probably some good resources that the university has so far that I've heard, to come and be here and research.
And also the word gets out, right? So that if there are artists, visual artists who know that this has been made possible, even though this might be a kind of, special, like a special package. But if they know that it's possible to access these collections, and then they know that there might be sources of funding here for a short amount of time, or what we've had already happen out of this experience, and even like the application experience, is other artists finding their own funding and then asking about coming here, and then of course they'll be able to do research here too. So part of it is, yes, resources, the other kinds of things that Francis had suggested, but it's also just letting it be known that this is an institution that is hospitable to those kinds of creative researchers, and I think that this is one small step in that direction. Yes, why don't we have Tita Deling and maybe the two of you be our last question, because we actually have merienda. We have food in Filipino fashion. We've got food for everybody.
Yeah,
It should be on. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm out of place here because I don't belong to the university. I am a resident of Ann Arbor from the Philippines, and I'm immigrant and raised my children here.
Huh?
And I don't even know if my question is out of place, because this has been I've been living here, I am aware that there is a very large collection of Philippine material here. My husband went here for history and he was aware of that.
Oh.
And so we never, what is anybody doing with them? And so I am very, I'm very glad that this is happening. But I'm also a first grade, second grade retired teacher. And when Francis said something about the letters, and also Maya said something about the homicides. And my question is more to the project people. Is there any way that I can look at what you have? Because what the word is, I'm curious what the homicides had for material, because one of my aunts was a homicide trained teacher.
Wow.
So this is the curiosity, and would I be permitted access to these so that maybe I can just, now artists are very good in the creativity part, and I'm very glad that you had them here, because artists of any kind, writers, poets, dancers, have a way of looking at one thing and maybe creatively find ways to how do you look at certain things. So again, that's my question. Would I have access to these materials? And I'm not asking for any grants or anything. I'm retired. I have time. So that's the question.
So there are two people right up front here who could answer your question. And one is sitting next to you, Nancy Bartlett, who is the Associate Director of the Bentley. And then I'll hand it to Robert, who can answer the other.
So
other
the
question.
short version of an answer is yes, by all means, you are more than welcome, as is anybody in this room and all of your friends, relatives, neighbors, to come to the Bentley Historical Library. We are open to the general public. We do have free parking right next door to the Bentley.
Yeah. it's a
And
big
we
deal.
have a reference staff that would be more than happy to help work with you, alongside you, on what your questions might be and what collections might be of interest to you. So there is that answer. And we do have school teachers who come with the interest of somehow thinking about a lesson plan that would involve the collections of the Bentley. So in fact, we just had a community high class come a couple of weeks ago. So, so it is something that we very much would welcome. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Martha.
I just want to repeat what Nancy said. Our reading room and our collections are open to everyone. You do not have to be a member of the university community or affiliated with any institution at all. So I'm in the university library, in special collections in the university library. Now, I don't think I can offer free parking. That's going to be a challenge down there on Central Campus, but our reading room is open to everyone.
You can have the last question, Tita.
Okay. One is out of curiosity. Because you have Filipino heritage and you look at these collections here, you read the letters or whatever it is that you look there. The anger as a Filipino looking at things here that are stored here and not available to people in the Philippines. So that's my only question. Anger, raw anger. Because, well, I came here in '68 for some special training. And I was curious about this collection. And so that was the first thing that I did here, first week. And I could not go back for a long time because I was very angry and it would have interrupted special training. I tried at Philippine Studies Conference and spoke about representations done here in the collection at the University of Michigan. And unfortunately, not everyone was interested to listen. And I'm not a very effective presenter. And again, I'm still angry about this whole thing. So I'm so glad that finally Ricky's here, Deirdre is here, and you are here. We're all here to the project.
Simple answer, yes. Yes, a lot of the content, a lot of the reading material, a lot of the text is angering. But this is something that we had talked about even yesterday, that, we have a feeling that maybe a week from now, 2 weeks, or maybe a couple months, that all that anger and all the sadness, also all the joy is just gonna come crashing down. But on top of that, I feel that it's important that we take this information and share that information, because a lot of people don't know, not just Filipinos, but also Americans. So for me, I personally feel like I need to set that anger aside just so I can share this information. When I go back to New York, I work with the Filipino and Filipino American community, and I do want to share this. And it is angering. It's not a sunshiny, smiley history, but that happens everywhere. But it's a story that has to be told. There's stories that have to be told.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for bringing that up, and I feel that so much. That's part of why it's been so good to be together, because at least the first time I encountered archives of this nature, I was so angry, so angry, but I had nowhere to put it. It goes in the work, but to hear you say that, it's an appropriate response to this. And I feel that very much, and that we don't get to be angry, but I'm angry. And yeah, that is a very hot, fiery, fierce force, anger and violence, and all of that. And it's in there, and it's really just, I know it's not nice to hear you say that, but it's good to know that this is what's going on. I just really feel that too.
I'll just quickly add on that I was experiencing a lot of anger earlier this week, especially after we had gone through so many images and so many things in the collections. And I was saying before how I just felt so overwhelmed and angry, and also feeling like there's this barrier between me and these objects that I'm looking at, that, I can't, really have a real relationship with them. I can't take them back to my family other than take photographs of them. And when I go back to the Philippines, I can show them. So definitely a very deep sense of anger, grief, something I think I'm going to be working through for a while. But then I think also Francis and Maya were saying, being able to process this anger together, I think is part of the process of this collective healing, I think, collective grief.
And thank you everyone for coming. This has been so wonderful to share this with you. Thank you to the artists for sharing with us. We know that, what you've done here and your time here is going to be incredibly impactful to the work that we have. Our own question, we have our own answer that we could have given to the question of how is this experience going to move us forward. And well, for coming, and now to eat. Kind of.